Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Dave.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, in the prime material, building a bard with depth.
In the wilds, the creepy lava child.
And in the tavern, what would you do if you happened upon an imprisoned lich?
Let's go. So what's up, Dave?
Not too much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you here. For those of you who are just joining us, Matt's not here this week, so one of our other guys, Dave, is filling in, and we're going to be talking about one of your characters this week.
That's right. Aegis, who was a bard and was the first character I really ever built for a D&D campaign.
Yeah, we're excited, and we're going to be just covering the topic here of just building a bard with character depth. But before we get to that, just like to remind everybody, just make sure to follow us on all our social medias. Hit us up on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and you can access our website on Buzzsprout, which is our podcast hosting site, and also support us on Patreon. We'll have some more cool things coming out soon. And of course, whenever we hit 250 followers on Twitter, we'll be giving away to a lucky Twitter follower whichever book they prefer, an official D&D source book, whether you still need to start your collection with the Player's Handbook or want the latest book, Eberron Rising from the Last War, whatever you prefer, we'll get one of those sent over to you for a lucky follower once we reach 250. So be sure to follow us and interact with us there. But all right, without any further ado, building a bard with depth. The Player's Handbook describes a bard this way. It says, whether a scholar, skald, or scoundrel, a bard weaves magic through words and music to inspire allies and demoralize foes, manipulate minds, create illusions, and even heal wounds. I think this is an excellent, broad description which lends itself to a wide range of customization options. There are many different paths, that a player character could take as a person who practices magic by uncovering and utilizing the words of creation in their own songs, as bards do. But a lot of times, at least in my experience, it doesn't get played out with as much diversity as with some other classes. A lot of PC bards seem to end up in just some version of a gregarious entertainer. And that's not to say that, the entertaining aspect of the class is not important, obviously. Sure. But many of our ideas have that entertainment aspect of the character as the primary aspect, rather than that trait being secondary to a PC's characterization. There's not as much depth, not as much roundness to the character sometimes. But I think whenever you built Aegis, interestingly, as the first character that you actually built, you actually ended up building a character with real depth, and it really helped me learn a little bit about building a bard with depth. So tell us a little bit about your character Aegis.
So I guess I started the character building process with a few fears, really. I was nervous about role-playing, and I was nervous about having to play a character that wasn't like me. And so I wanted to start with some character motivations that were in line with my own, so I didn't constantly feel like I had to be making something up or building this character from scratch. I could kind of rely on my own background and my own thoughts and use those to motivate my decisions in game. So I'm an archaeologist. I spend a lot of time thinking about the past and how we present that past to people and how we educate. And so I had this idea to build a character who was concerned with those same things. And so I decided that maybe I could do something along the lines of a epic poet, something like in the mold of Homer or one of the other Greek poets, who is doing some combination of history and entertainment. And I sort of came to you with that idea, and we built the character out from there.
Yeah.
But I would say it sort of started with my own background and thinking that I wanted to do something that was a little bit similar to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it worked out really well because in the homebrew world that we created, the tieflings, which is the race that you ended up choosing, actually mostly were annihilated in a war which took place over 1,000 years ago from whenever the beginning of the campaign started, and you were able to build this character, this bard in the College of Lore, where your goal was preserving your people's history. It was uncovering and gathering these stories, and it was just a whole different take on your bard's gathering of lore. You did use your bardic skills to make ends meet, but you aren't the typical gregarious entertainer. You had motivations other than that for your entertainment purposes.
Yeah, my lack of experience may have helped a little bit in creating a character that was a little bit different, because I wasn't really coming to this with a lot of expectations about what a bard is supposed to look like, because I didn't have that D&D background already. And so all I know is what I think of when I think of a bard, and I think of an epic poet.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely
did it in that vein.
Yeah. And I know with you, this really taught me a valuable lesson, and it's applicable for all classes, but especially for the bard, I think, because you really started with the character's passion and then build the character out from there. And so I think the number one question we have to ask ourselves when rolling a bard character is, what is this character's passion? What is this bard's passion? I think with bards, it's easy for us to just say that their passion in life is that of being a bard. The character's desire was to be an entertainer. The class becomes the passion in a way, more so than other classes, and so you have to find other elements of your background which actually create any sort of character depth, because your class doesn't provide it necessarily on its own. And so I think it's really important. What I learned from you was just finding out what inherent passion there is behind the character becoming a bard, and going from there, because that can really influence the character.
Right. And it's not I wasn't really sure going into this like how people typically make these kinds of decisions. And I know from my own experience playing Skyrim or whatever that I'm mostly, when I'm doing that, I'm mostly thinking about what kind of actions do I want to be taking in game, and I'm not thinking a ton about the background of my Skyrim character. And
you were crossing a border and got caught, and now everything in your past is forgotten.
Yes,
and now it's just from here on out.
Right. From here on out, I'm like striking people with lightning bolts, and that's all I care about. But with this, I really wanted to start with that motivation, because I thought it would help in terms of making the character choices in game a little bit easier for me in terms of that sort of storytelling element.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we thought we'd do today is, in light of Aegis with his passion of preserving his culture being, I think, a great motivation, a great passion for a bard that's going to be in the College of Lore for the bard class, is to go through all the bard college options and possible passions which one could have to narratively influence the background of your bard, and give him a passion that gives him a little bit more of a depth as you work together in your group to collaboratively tell this story of your particular bard. So first we have your college, the College of Lore, and just reading directly out of the source material in the player's handbook. Do you want to read the summary for us?
Yeah, sure. So bards of the College of Lore know something about most things, collecting bits of knowledge from sources as diverse as scholarly tomes and peasant tales. Whether singing folk ballads in taverns or elaborate compositions in royal courts, these bards use their gifts to hold audiences spellbound. When the applause dies down, the audience members might find themselves questioning everything they held to be true, from their faith in the priesthood of the local temple to their loyalty to the king. The loyalty of these bards lies in the pursuit of beauty and truth, not in fealty to a monarch or following the tenets of a deity. A noble who keeps such a bard as a herald or advisor knows that the bard would rather be honest than politic. The college's members gather in libraries and sometimes in actual colleges, complete with classrooms and dormitories, to share their lore with one another. They also meet at festivals or affairs of state, where they can expose corruption, unravel lies, and poke fun at self-important figures of authority.
This, to me, is the classic bard. Mm-hmm. Your other colleges, like the College of Glamour and the College of Valor and other sorts of colleges, are have special twists on being a bard. But this, to me, is just a bard as it was when you're talking about the Nordic skalds of old. You know, this is just what a bard traditionally was when you traditionally think of a bard, even in a real world Earth setting.
Sure.
And again, a great passion for this study of lore, and that's perhaps a little bit out of the norm is yours. This idea of preserving history, this idea of, or maybe even being in a setting where there's a lot of lost history. You know, one of the big things that makes D&D worlds distinct is that they're old worlds with lots of ancient pasts and pasts which affect the future and ruins and all sorts of things like this. And you could perhaps have some sort of motivation or passion behind recovering some of that history.
Yeah.
Perhaps you're a member of a family that used to be very prominent and now is no longer prominent, and your passion is recovering that lost history and using your bardic skills to spread the word about the heroic events that your ancestors did to increase the standing of your family.
Yeah, and I think for reading through this, one of the things that strikes me as being potentially interesting and giving players and I guess just a lot of opportunities to explore the world a little bit is that because you don't swear allegiance to a deity or a king, you kind of get to have your own thing, right? That maybe plays into the story that you're telling closely, and maybe it doesn't. But you get to sort of find that passion and run with it, and it can be sort of integral to the story or story adjacent.
The next college that we wanted to look at is the College of Glamour. This is found in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, one of the 3 bard subclasses which was released there. And the summary in Xanathar's Guide says, the College of Glamour is the home of bards who mastered their craft in the vibrant realm of the Feywild, or under the tutelage of someone who dwelled there. Tutored by satyrs, Eladrin, and other fae, these bards learn to use their magic to delight and captivate others. The bards of this college are regarded with a mixture of awe and fear. Their performances are the stuff of legend. These bards are so eloquent that a speech or song that one of them performs can cause captors to release the bard unharmed, or can lull a furious dragon into complacency. The same magic that allows them to quell beasts can also bend minds. Villainous bards of this college can leech off of a community for weeks, abusing their magic to turn their hosts into thralls. Heroic bards of this college instead use this power to gladden the downtrodden and undermine oppressors. So what are some good passions that we could have potentially in this college?
Yeah, this is interesting to me, and this I remember when I was reading through these initially. This was one that I think I struggled with. This was the college that I didn't necessarily have any expectations that I could tie to this or past experiences where I thought, oh yeah, this is that kind of character. Mm-hmm. And so this was one that I have a hard time envisioning. But
it's interesting because it's depending on your setting, there may or may not be very vibrant interaction between the Feywild and the prime material plane. The first thing that came to mind for me was what if you are a creature of the Feywild? If you're some sort of Eladrin or some other native of the Feywild, perhaps you're someone who wants to just flaunt the glories of the Feywild to the prime material, or perhaps in another vein, to play up the mind magic which this College of Glamour seems to push you towards. Perhaps this is someone that's had a history, either personal or family, history of anxiety or depression. And they specifically set out to master this special realm of bardic craft within the vibrant and lively Feywild, with the goal of using their music to bring light and levity into the minds of those struggling with various mental illnesses. And I think that would be a very noble passion to explore as a character, as you're trying to go through a campaign.
Yeah, and that's an exciting one to me too, because it's the kind of thing where a player playing a character like that gets to, bring some of their own experiences and some of their own passions into playing a character.
Yeah.
I like that idea a lot.
The third college, back to the player's handbook, the classic College of Valor.
So, bards of the College of Valor are daring skalds whose tales keep alive the memory of the great heroes of the past and thereby inspire a new generation of heroes. These bards gather in mead halls or around great bonfires to sing the deeds of the mighty, both past and present. They travel the lands to witness great events firsthand and to ensure that the memory of those events doesn't pass from the world. With their songs, they inspire others to reach the same heights of accomplishment as the heroes of old.
When I first started thinking of the College of Valor, the first thought that I had was perhaps this bard, perhaps this PC has someone whose legendary exploits they want to make sure live on, like a specific person that's in their past, like as we mentioned before, with a respected family member or just a family, just wanting to make sure that these things live on, or maybe even just a personal idol or hero that's inspired them or maybe impacted them tremendously personally as a child. And they decided to go down this route of bardic training in order to make sure that these specific things were really lauded.
Yeah, and this was one that I thought about for a good long time for Aegis specifically, because a lot of this is sort of similar to or adjacent to what I wanted to do with that character specifically. The reason I didn't go with this is because it felt a little bit too focused on individual heroes for what I wanted for Aegis. Aegis being more about sort of cultural preservation and celebrating heritage.
A whole people group, rather than just a person.
Right. And so I thought about Aegis as being more, having more to do with preserving specific traditions and ideas rather than celebrating individual people.
Another option in this class would be perhaps this character was already a bard, and this is an interesting place to take subclasses. Is perhaps somebody was, no matter what class, whether it's a bard or a rogue or a paladin or what, perhaps they were already headed down this path, but then something changed or altered their trajectory and headed them down a specific subclass. In this case, perhaps they were already a bard, but then they were rescued or saved by this certain person, and then they just decided to start taking their bardic magic in this sort of direction, not even just maybe to laud the actions of this person who impacted them so much, but perhaps they were so inspired by watching this act of heroism that they now, their passion is just this idea of the College of Valor, of upholding legendary acts of heroism.
Yeah. So if you were building a character like that, how would you approach it? I mean, would you want that the person who had rescued them, the person who sort of put them on that path, would you want them be part of the campaign?
I guess it depends on your setting and exactly perhaps how long ago that instance was. Something, a player character would have to work with their DM to actually figure out. I can think of pretty interesting interactions which could actually happen if that person was at least still around. Having those sort of people that you don't interact with on a day-to-day basis within your own adventuring party, but having your family that you can go home to, having your mentor that you can go back to the college and interact with, having this person that you look up to out there in the world who you can go to and seek for advice in a low point in the campaign, or having those people in the world, I think is a great boon to storytelling. Whether or not they're actually actively with the party on a day-to-day basis, perhaps they could be for a short time in the course of whichever direction the campaign is. But definitely having them as part of the world, I think, is an excellent thing to have when you're talking about especially people who are bards of the College of Valor.
Yeah, I imagine that kind of fills out the world in a satisfying way, and it gives players a little something fun to discover and play with.
Yeah, it's more depth, not just to the world, but it's more depth to your character, because you can show up with your adventuring party to a specific city, and your adventuring party is just there to buy potions and armor, and you're like, oh, let's go over here to this person's house, and there's this interaction that they did not expect. They had no inkling that this was about to happen, and it's just a period and opportunity for character growth and a chance for the party to bond closer together.
Yeah, and maybe there's sort of there's potential for fun character development there, where you could play that as the DM, right? You could play that character in multiple different ways. I could imagine that this person who is being lionized by this bard from the College of Valor might feel a little bit, maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable about having this person like singing songs about them everywhere they go. I don't know. Maybe they didn't want that kind of fame, and they're a little bit resentful of it or something.
It could be. There's all sorts of real interesting interactions. Our decisions certainly impact everything else. That's the fun nature of something so flexible as a role-playing game, where it's not just pieces to move on a board that's in just one specific manner. Fourthly, the College of Swords. This is back to Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and this is one of the more unique bards, as the summary here will say, entertains through feats of weapon prowesses. And if you actually look at the class, you actually get things called flourishes with your blade. You really become, you're a sword swallower. You're a sword juggler, and it's a real interesting aspect of the entertaining aspect behind a bard without necessarily entirely using musical instruments.
Yeah, this one is interesting, and I don't know that this one read so much to me as a bard, right? And it just feels very fundamentally different, but I guess you still have that entertainer aspect, which is what keeps it within that the class.
It is interesting because obviously while the summary of the class, and we'll read it here, but the summary of the class, it doesn't mention anything about musical instruments, and yet as a bard you still have some of your proficiencies in musical instruments and stuff like that, which you don't lose because you're still a bard, but that doesn't seem to be your primary aspect of your entertaining. But the summary in Xanathar's Guide just says, bards of the College of Swords are called blades, and they entertain through daring feats of weapon prowess. Blades perform stunts such as sword swallowing, knife throwing, and juggling, and mock combats. Though they use their weapons to entertain, they're also highly trained and skilled warriors in their own right. Their talent with weapons inspires many blades to lead double lives. One blade might use a circus troupe as cover for nefarious deeds such as assassination, robbery, and blackmail. Other blades strike at the wicked, bringing justice to bear against the cruel and powerful. Most troops are happy to accept a blade's talent for the excitement it adds to a performance, but few entertainers fully trust a blade in their ranks. Blades who abandon their lives as entertainers have often run into trouble that makes maintaining their secret activities impossible. A blade caught stealing or engaging in vigilante justice is too great a liability for most troops. With their weapon skills and magic, these blades either take up work as enforcers for thieves' guilds or strike out on their own as adventurers.
There's some fun directions you could take this, right? If you're thinking about passions, and one of the passions that is driving bards is the idea that they love entertaining people, right? I think this is sort of like that daredevil, you could build this in like an Evel Knievel sort of mold of someone who really enjoys thrilling people in that way, and it's not really clear to me. It's not obvious how you build this kind of a character, but that's where my mind goes with this. Is someone who just loves living life on the edge and thrilling people through that.
I think that's a great passion. Some Evel Knievel is a great example. Somebody who's wanting to entertain through acts which are simultaneously so entertaining and yet extremely scary. The old cliche of covering your eyes but parting your fingers just slightly so you can see through. He loves doing gross and freaky things. Magicians who use a lot of magic in the real world with gross things like the inhaling the bean through the nose and having it come out of the eye socket. The gross things where they use the rubber cement and the fake flesh and cut something out of their bodies. That kind of passion, just the passion to be this outlandish figure, I think is a great passion for a bard from this class. I think the vigilante suggestion brought up by the description, I think that's a great passion as well. I also like the idea, kind of on the opposite spectrum of what we're talking about, of somebody perhaps being an insecure performer, perhaps one who was, again, already even a bard, but who was maybe failing at it, or perhaps had a very traumatic event occur. And this person hones their swordplay skills so ferociously in an attempt to not feel vulnerable. And this plays up the idea of that you're not really using your musical instruments. Perhaps you were at the Bard's College and you're just falling way behind your classmates on the lute and the lyre. And you're feeling inadequate. And perhaps your passion is to really hone your swordplay skills. Perhaps you even had a tendon injury or something which really messed up your the use of your hands in terms of the finesse that you need to pluck the strings or play the notes on a certain instrument, and now you learned a different way of using this magic that the bards hone from the words of creation still within the universe. That you're honing and getting that through your swordplay rather than through the play of an instrument.
And I like this idea of building the character using insecurities too. I mean, I think that certainly that was not my intention when I built Aegis. Wasn't to, I guess I didn't start with the bad characteristics. I started with passions, but starting with bad characteristics, or at least building those into a character, seems like a way to make that character more complete and compelling. And
a lot of us like to skip through. It's one of the things on the right on the top of your character sheet. It just has that little section that says flaws, but we like to we skip that section a lot, but to add true depth to any character, having that is, I think, supremely important.
And this is, in my limited to this point D&D experience, it's one of the things that I find most exciting and interesting is when you have people playing their characters in ways that feel flawed in an authentic way, right? Like, this character doesn't necessarily do things right all the time, but they have but they live by a code, or they have a history that leads them to acting in a certain way, being impulsive or whatever it is.
Sure.
And insecurity, I think, is a really interesting one to explore. And especially in this specific context, right? If you're trying to thrill people, the way you're talking about it reminds me of someone who's trying to get more views on their YouTube channel and does so by doing something that is like incredibly over the top and shocking, right? They've been frustrated that they can't get their views up, and so they try and do something that's like as over the top as possible, and maybe that falls into this sort of description as well.
I think that's a great analog. The final official class is the College of Whispers, also in the Xanathar's Guide to Everything. What's the description there, Dave?
So most folk are happy to welcome a bard into their midst. Bards of the College of Whispers use this to their advantage. They appear to be like any other bard, sharing news, singing songs, and telling tales to the audiences they gather. In truth, the College of Whispers teaches its students that they are wolves among sheep. These bards use their knowledge and magic to uncover secrets and turn them against others through extortion and threats. Many other bards hate the College of Whispers, viewing it as a parasite that uses the bard's reputation to acquire wealth and power. For this reason, these bards rarely reveal their true nature unless they must. They typically claim to follow some other college or keep their true nature secret in order to better infiltrate and exploit royal courts and other settings of power.
This, to me, is like a classic nefarious bard.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be, too. Some good passions could be simple, mere survival. They grew up on the streets and, almost like an Oliver Twist type character who's in the care of Fagin, and, they're resorting to thievery. And they've learned how to do everything to pool everything into their own advantage. They've learned how to extort, they've learned how to steal, they've learned how to and then as they grew and became a bard, they just continued in that kind of underhanded lifestyle of using these skills that they've acquired still in the same vein of being an extortionist, for lack of a better term.
Right. The other thing that this brings to mind for me is taking this in sort of like a Robin Hood direction, where you get you get to do the sort of sneaky stuff, but it's
for good.
With good
this
intentions.
Is Batman's bard class.
Yeah, right.
This is what Batman plays if he's a bard. This is what Bruce Wayne would roll on his character sheet.
Yeah, right. And that's interesting to me too, that you get to have this element of doing good in sort of unconventional ways, maybe? Yeah. Or not doing good, which would also be interesting,
Yeah, I don't know how many of our listeners are familiar with Critical Role, but in their first campaign, the bard character of Scanlan ended up having a daughter, and the daughter's character named Kaylee, she became a bard and was traveling the world trying to find Scanlan. And while I don't think she was in the College of Whispers by any stretch of the imagination, that kind of made me think, another great passion for someone in the College of Whispers is if there's someone in your character's background that has wronged you or a friend or family member personally. You became a bard to travel the world seeking to use your knowledge and conniving to actually bring them down. You wanted to infiltrate their organizations, to exploit them, to extort them, and do whatever you could to harm them as people because of what they'd done to you in the past.
Right.
And that is, I think, another way that you could take another passion behind a good College of Whispers bard.
Yeah, right. And I also like that if that maybe that particular wronging has created a particular frustration in this character with corruption or something.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And then you get to sort of use your talents as a bard of the College of Whispers to battle corruption, right? Secretly from inside the court or something like that. Right?
The last college we're going to discuss is not an official college. It was one released a few months ago in the Unearthed Arcana called the College of Eloquence. It says, adherents of the College of Eloquence master the art of oratory. Persuasion is regarded as a high art, and a well-reasoned, well-spoken argument often proves more powerful than objective truth. These bards wield a blend of logic and theatrical wordplay, winning over skeptics and detractors with logical arguments and plucking at heartstrings to appeal to the emotions of entire audiences. And this is an interesting variant because this subclass is described in many ways that the blades of the College of Swords don't have as much focus on their instruments. This is described as much more of an orator than an actual magician. It's someone who was a Shakespearean actor who, or just someone who's really good at monologuing in front of people and inspiring them, or a good debater, or someone in
that's
what
it really brought to mind for me is someone who really enjoys logic and making arguments. The kind of person who was the captain of their debate team in high school, right? Like that's what I'm thinking about when I read this. Yeah, this is someone who really enjoys crafting arguments, right? So like a lawyer, right? That's sort of what I'm thinking of here.
Yeah, absolutely. Having someone who weaves their bardic magic with just their words is just a very intriguing aspect to me. And going this route rather than going with traditional instruments, although again, as a bard, you are going to have some instrumental skills, it, I think, makes for a very interesting character decision-making process. Yeah. It could, again, as we mentioned with the College of Swords, having a bard that wasn't as talented as his peers, someone who couldn't actually make it as a musical bard, but he was so passionate about becoming better that he figured out some way to weave his magic around just his monologues. Yeah. Or it could work into your flaw. It could be that this is somebody who is an extremely prideful person, and his very flawed passion is just simply always being right. Sure, and you have somebody who is just interested in always proving his point. Right. And that can create some interesting party dynamics. Yeah. It can create some interesting role-play encounters when you're talking about being the very charismatic person that the bard is, the face of the group, oftentimes going forward and being the person most often talking to the NPC who's not letting you into this particular building and trying to convince them otherwise. Yeah. It can create some interesting decisions as you're building your PC.
Yeah. And if you wanted to do this in a more musical way, I mean, I was sort of thinking of like what sort of musicians might fall into this college, even though they're musicians. And the person I was thinking of was Bob Dylan, who is by no means the most technically proficient guitar player or singer, but he's a great lyricist, right? And people think about Bob Dylan as being a poet and being someone who has a cause that they are passionate about and gets it out that way.
And what about, you just mentioned poet? What about a poet? Yes, somebody who's a songwriter, maybe not somebody who is as skilled in the instruments, but their passion is songwriting. Yeah, right. And they actually love being the lyricist. Sure. I think that's another great passion for someone of these colleges to have. Yeah. But that's just a little summary of perhaps building a bard with some better depth. You ready to head to the wilds?
Absolutely.
Let's head there. So we're here in the wilds. Today we're looking at Lava Children, one of the strangest names and also one of the creepiest and most awesome creatures in D&D lore, in my opinion. And if you have never seen a picture of one of these, please do yourself a favor and pause the podcast and look it up, and you will not be disappointed. But better yet, as is the theme of the podcast, they provide some great collaborative storytelling opportunities. They first appeared in first edition in the Fiend Folio of 1981, but they really haven't appeared much in any other materials until 5th edition, and even in this edition, they didn't appear until the release of Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage in November of 2018. You can find some basic information and their stat block in pages 312 and 313 of that volume if you're looking for a little bit of information on them, and then their stat block for actually using them in combat.
And so in our campaign with Aegis, we got to have an encounter with some of these, and I'm curious why you decided to bring them in.
Yeah. For one, they're a very interesting monster to fight. Mm-hmm. They create a great combat encounter because they are quite literally immune to metal. Mm-hmm. And secondly, they're not evil. Their alignment in their stat block, their 5e stat block, is neutral, and for good reason, because they're not violent by nature. They, as it says in their information, they just fiercely defend territory that they claim as their own, and so they can provide a very interesting encounter, whether you are just wanting to throw them at a party as a DM just in order to be a combatant, mm-hmm. just to have them figure out the first time your paladin swings a sword and it passes right through them and just see the look on their face, or if whether or not you want to actually give a good option of whether or not you can role play versus actually dealing in combat with these specific characters. But just as a little bit of a background to the Lava Child, they're physically identical to one another. They have these they're really stacked. They're really muscular. Their size is actually medium, so they're about the same as your standard humanoid. Okay. But they look childish, even though they're really built. Their faces look like kids, and their faces, and this is what makes them so creepy, are perpetually grinning. They are not solitary creatures. They form communities, sometimes even worshiping in gods of fire and earth, mm-hmm. Or they are serving primordial beings. Most of them are actually found in the Fountain of Creation, which is the inner plane where the plane of fire and the plane of earth come together, and it's a very volcano. It's basically a giant volcano range, with magma and caverns and all sorts of volcanoes and stuff like that. And where you'll find them on the prime material plane is usually around lava. Okay. They just create these communities in these spaces, and again, when they're in those communities, they're not necessarily evil. They're just going to defend where they're at all costs. Okay. They will be vicious if they need to, but they will actually converse with you if you roll high enough on your charisma check. Yeah, right. They're not stupid. They've got an intelligence rating of 11, and they can speak Common and along with Ignan, and they just provide such an interesting storytelling element. When you guys encountered them in our session, it was in an underground cavern where there was this lava river, and in that particular area, the membrane between the planes had began to falter, and you had some lava children who had just come through from the fountains of creation into the prime material here at this lava area. Mm-hmm. But y'all guys had a choice. You were there for a reason. You could have just annihilated them, but you kind of sat back and you watched them, and you saw that they were just guarding this portal, this area where the membrane was so thin between the planes where you could pass through. Yeah. They were guarding to keep where they were at in the fountains of creation safe.
Yeah.
And you guys were actually able to go up to them, and you especially as Aegis were able to actually talk to them and talk them down. And y'all guys were able to get all the way through that encounter without ever having to cross blades with them.
Yeah, right. Was that disappointing for you? Did you want us to fight them?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. As a DM, I must say that having their unique stats of being immune to metal is quite intriguing. Mechanically, how that works is they can just move through metal without hindrance. And it has advantage on attack rolls against any creature wearing metal armor or using a metal shield. So not only does it make it interesting because they can just pass through metal objects that doesn't even act as a barrier to them. They have advantage on attack rolls for most of your party because any of your party that's not wearing leather armor is going to be wearing some form of metallic armor or having a metal shield. And they're also, under their damage immunities, they can't be hurt by fire because they're lava children. They literally play in the lava if you read their lore. And they are immune to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from metal weapons. Yeah. If you go and slash at them with a weapon of that description, it just passes right through them. Yeah. And it just provides a really interesting encounter. But all that being said, I think the most interesting part about them is the idea that they aren't just hostile creatures.
Sure.
D&D is filled with hostile creatures where you either have to sneak past it or as soon as you're detected, you're going to be attacked. Yeah, right. And this is something different. And I think it provides a great opportunity for DMs to throw at players, whether you are in any sort of plane hopping setting and you end up near the fountains of creation, or you end up somewhere on the plane of fire, underground near some magma lake. You can throw these guys in. You can throw these guys in basically any excavation into the Underdark. Any exploration is very easy to have a party come across a lava river where these guys are nearby. And if you really want a combat encounter, their special abilities to have essentially metal phasing allows them to make great ambushers. If you're in a sort of area, you actually see this on page 175 of the of Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. I believe it's in the 13th level. There's a particular room in the dungeon, in Halaster Blackcloak's dungeon, where these lava children are actually inside this scrap metal thing. And they're just sitting literally inside the metal because they can just meld through it wherever they want. And they're just sitting there waiting for your adventurers to come through, and then they just phase out of the wall like a ghost and just ambush your party like, oh, you're here in our territory, we're just now going to attack. And so I think in those ways they provide very interesting both role play and combat encounter in your in your games.
And are these the kind of beings that are relatively obscure? I'm not at all calibrated on this, so I don't know, like, are players likely to know about these, and are characters likely to know what they are when they encounter them?
Characters probably, I would say, are much less likely to know. Yeah. Hardcore D&D players probably know what this is. Yeah. Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage is a popular volume. Yeah, okay. It's a very extensive dungeon crawl, which takes you from level 5 to level 20. Yeah, sure. It's a very, very extensive adventure. Yeah, okay. And most people were probably familiar with Lava Children from there. Okay. But at the same time, they're not in the traditional monster manual. They're not in Volo's Guide to Monsters either, or even in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, or anything like that. So it is quite possible that even your players might be unfamiliar with them.
Yeah.
But your characters, I would say, almost certainly aren't, unless they roll really high on their nature check or their or their history check.
Okay.
These guys being mostly found in the fountains of creation and not found on the prime material that often, and only then in the deep underdark where lava is.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about something which is not very likely for your players to come across.
Sure.
So in that way, they also provide that surprise aspect too of
Right.
you don't know when you encounter them until you start firing your arrows and swinging your swords that your metal weapons aren't going to work.
Yep.
And that just adds to the entertaining aspect of the encounter and makes, again, for a good story. All right, that wraps up Lava Children. Ready to head back to the tavern?
Absolutely.
All right, so what was it you said at the beginning of the episode? What would I do if what now?
What would you do if you came across an imprisoned lich?
That seems problematic.
To say the least.
That seems very problematic. What we're referencing here is actually something which actually occurred with Aegis, where y'all guys came across a lich in a magical enclosure. But here, like, what would we do if you just came across an imprisoned lich? And what I find interesting about encounters like this is if you come across an imprisoned something that has a challenge rating so much higher than what you're currently at, you can actually do that in this case because you're coming across something that's actually imprisoned.
Right.
You can interact with something that's so nefarious, so evil, something that is a challenge rating a dozen levels higher than your player characters, and still be able to actually have an interaction with that foe because he's imprisoned.
Yeah.
And it makes an interesting story opportunity.
Yeah, and it really raised the stakes.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, this was right at the beginning of our campaign, and we walk into what ends up being, I mean, it's sort of really our first encounter, and there's this being there that everyone knows is well beyond our means to fight it.
Yes.
And so it really made it, I don't know, it's sort of, there's this real kind of narrative hook there that really gets it really got us interested and intrigued and afraid.
Yeah. In y'all's case, the condition was that what trapped him there was still an active force. There was something that was siphoning off his necrotic energy, and perhaps this force is now something you have to deal with. Perhaps the force is something that's just as nefarious or even more nefarious than a lich is. You know, you have the potential, you know, if your DM just said, what do? You come across a lich in a cave that's trapped behind a magical barrier, or that's just stuck in place, or is imprisoned in shackles and unable to use his verbal or somatic components to be able to actually break free, or however your DM puts it to you. What would you do? You know, you've got options like you could interact with the lich, perhaps try to strike a deal to free him, you know, hoping that she could bless you with some sort of magical artifact or some sort of power of some sort. Good opportunity for a puzzle, too, if you're actually trying to break something. Good opportunity if you are a group that actually likes real-life puzzles to work through in your game, as ours is.
Sure. And as I recall, we had two pretty distinct reactions to encountering this within the party.
Yes.
Where we had our paladin just immediately want to fight it.
Yes.
Right. And the rest of us treating this with a lot of cautious apprehension and wanting to figure out what exactly is going on. How is it possible that this lich could actually be kept prisoner here?
Yeah, contained.
And so I think a few of us were treating it sort of as a puzzle, and then we had one other member in the party treating it as a opportunity to hit something with a sword.
Yeah. And there's the nature of a lich in specific is an interesting one because liches are only able to survive with use of their phylactery.
Right.
You know, and theoretically, even if a lich was imprisoned in a magical enclosure, if their phylactery was not also imprisoned or sealed off, or perhaps sealed in another plane of existence, or something in some way that is affected as well, the lich could just kill himself and reform elsewhere. Wherever the phylactery is. And so there's an interesting narrative hook there too of if your players roll a high enough on their check, if they are not familiar with what a lich actually is. Y'all guys were able to figure out with an Oath of Vengeance paladin and your lore skills as Aegis. There's lots of different interesting hooks that you could take off of this little encounter.
Absolutely.
But that being said, I think that'll just wrap up the tavern for us today. Thanks, Dave, for stopping by for today's episode.
My pleasure.
As always, links and attribution for sound effects can be found in the show notes. Special thanks from all of us here at Plot Hooks: Samuel, Dave, Matt, Mike, Zach, Becca, and podcast pupper Ellie. And we will catch you all next week.